All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Miranda Lash, and I am the Ellen Bruss Senior Curator at MCA Denver, and I will be your host this evening. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for Focus, an enlightening conversation series about contemporary art. This is the first event in what we plan to be a regular series every quarter. For this iteration, we are partnering with Christie's Auction House, and through our powers combined, we will present you with an exciting, up-to-the-minute look at the art market of 2020 with a specific focus this evening on recent art auctions. Before I welcome our special guest, I just have a bit of housekeeping to take care of. First, please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation, and we will get to them at the end. Secondly, also feel free to put any observations or reactions in the chat throughout. We would love to hear what's on your mind. And with that out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our special guest this evening, Kat Whiting. Kat is a specialist and head of the afternoon sale in the post-war and contemporary art department at Christie's Auction House in New York. She joined Christie's in 2014 and is responsible for sourcing for and selling the department's afternoon sale of contemporary art in May and November, totaling $70 million per year. She appraises unique works of art from 1945 to the present day for private clients, museums, and corporations. Prior to joining Christie's, Kat was at Pace Gallery, and prior to that, she was a curatorial assistant for public art at the High Line in New York. She earned an MA degree in history of art and the art market with a focus on modern and contemporary from Christie's Education and a BA from Colgate University with a major in art history. She received high honors in art history for her thesis on the work of Robert Colescott. Please join me in welcoming Kat Whiting.
Thank you, Miranda. That was a long intro, and thank you to the MCA Denver as well for having us tonight. This is very exciting. I wish we could be there in person, as I'm sure we all do, but virtually it's great to see you all. And it's great to hear so much about all the great exhibitions that you have on in person as well. So we'll talk about that, I know, a little bit later. It's a teaser for everyone out there who's joining us. Today, what I would love to talk to you about are really two topics. Obviously, the art market and auction houses is a very large topic to cover just in this short amount of time. So what I want to focus on right now is two different questions that I often get asked as a specialist, which the first one is, what is the market for art right now and what should I collect? And that has been even tougher during the pandemic, where a lot of galleries are closed, museums have been closed temporarily, auction houses have been closed. But there are ways to navigate that I'm going to talk about today. The second question that I get often is, how do you even value a work of art? I mean, these objects are unique in what I work with. And when you go to a museum, you even think these objects are priceless, they're invaluable. So we have to place a value on these works. Even in museums, we provide insurance appraisals for museums. So there is a value for every object. And what I want to give to you today, and what I want you to take away with after this presentation, are different determinants of value and ways of looking at art through the lens of providing a value to that piece, so that in collecting or even in going to a museum or a gallery, you can use these tools and these questions to be able to take with you and ask yourself these questions when you look at art. So you're looking at it in terms of monetary value, as well as perhaps art historical or personal value. So I find all of these questions really interesting, and we'll look forward to, after the presentation as well, Miranda and I will have a bit of a Q&A session. So we definitely encourage a lot of you to jump in as well after that. So to dive in, I'm a little nostalgic looking at this this image of the Christie's auction house that you can see, which is filled with people in the room, which is typically our evening sale. And here next, I'm going to talk a little bit about basically what we've been seeing in the pandemic in terms of museum response. So you can see here, a lot of different museums have created different virtual programs for different collectors or visitors to the museum. I even shared a little bit of the MCA Denver in the lower right of the great Keith Haring exhibition that you guys have coming up. And I know that Miranda's going to touch on a little bit later. In addition to that, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has done virtual exhibitions. Google Arts and Culture has done walkthroughs. The Smithsonian has done even VR portions. This just goes to show that, although a lot of museums have had closures and although artists aren't in their studios and there have been a lot of barriers to entry during the pandemic, in a way, the silver lining has been a lot of innovation has happened. And in that way, there have been a lot of programs and ways of engagement that perhaps wouldn't have happened otherwise. So that also is true for galleries. And we've seen a lot of art fairs moving online out of necessity. I put the Frieze viewing room up here, which had the Cecily Brown, and the Gagosian room, which sold for almost $5 million. And that just goes to show that these viewing rooms, while having varied success, still have had success over the pandemic. We've also seen, Platform at David's Warner, which is a great initiative where a lot of different smaller galleries were able to go on their larger site to give visibility to some galleries that perhaps would be even harder hit during the pandemic. I'm including an Instagram handle that I quite like called Art of Social Distancing, which shows a lot of exhibitions that weren't able to happen during the pandemic. So it includes some images of artists' work that wasn't able to be shown and should have been. And Instagram has been a huge outlet to me, I'm sure to a lot of you as well, in terms of being able to engage while we're from home. And I include also a video still of a Shara Hughes Zoom studio visit that I was able to join. So the ability of interacting with artists on these platforms has been quite special. And I think that's something that has come out of the pandemic and of working and living from home that perhaps wouldn't have been as easily accessible without this necessity. So, in terms of all of this, I think obviously the auction houses have had their own response to the pandemic and to these moments of adversity that we've come across. So to do that, I'm going to kind of do a fun look through history in terms of the auction world, and especially for Christie's. And I have pulled up two images on my screen. Christie's was started in 1766, so it's been around for over 250 years, which is quite miraculous. You can see on the left-hand side, this is in 1808, an image of the auction room, not that different than the first image that I showed you on the intro slide. You can see the auctioneer at the rostrum, and the room is filled with eager bidders. This is from Ackerman's Microcosm of London. I then include an image of Christie's in 1987. This is of the exciting sale of Van Gogh's Sunflowers, which at the time was estimated for a whopping 16 million, which was, harrowing in terms of how expensive it was. And it ended up selling for over $36 million at the time. What I love about this picture and why I like bringing it up in auction history is that auctions used to be, there used to be a dress code for auctions. So you can see here, everyone's in tuxedos and in black tie, which I kind of love. Now everyone goes casually, but there's something kind of nostalgic about seeing that as well. So here's Christie's now in 2020. I mean, we really did shift from that 2019 image you saw at the beginning to a completely different model. And again, this has been out of necessity, but also these innovations have been quite interesting to me in terms of how I see the market now. And that's really going back to answering that first question I had, right? What is the market now? What do I see in the art market right now? And as you can see here, obviously even our auction room has completely transformed. No longer do we have a room filled with clients eager to bid. We're specialists on the phone with those clients, and that's who you can see socially distanced in the room here. But a lot of what we're relying on now is online and technology. So you can see also the auctioneer, instead of pointing to people in the room, is pointing to people in different locations. So we have an Asia desk, we have a desk in London, we have all of our different colleagues around the world bidding from different locations, and an auctioneer as kind of a referee trying to sort through all of that. You can also see in that picture two commentators who are commenting on what's happening in the auction, almost like a sports game. And so these innovations have really helped us adapt during the pandemic as well as innovate. This is only one portion of the innovation of the auction room. Other innovations that we've had to look towards are, what do we do about our exhibitions? Typically, we had hundreds of thousands of people come to see our exhibitions during the pandemic. We haven't been able to do that. And we've had to have, by appointment viewings, or in some locations, our exhibitions have been closed for a period of time just because of local, ordinances and things like that. So it's been very tough, but at the same time, we've thus had to innovate and therefore created these virtual walkthroughs that you can actually walk through Christie's almost as if you're there in person. We've also created the ability to have a lot of video technology on our web pages so that you can see the works as if you were panning over them in person. It's hard to really completely replicate what you can get standing in front of an artwork. And at the end of the day, that's why we're all here, because we love that emotional experience of standing in front of something and reacting to it. But we're trying to create the next best thing. And that's what I think a lot of this technology has been able to do, is give us those tools to be able to recreate that experience. The other thing we've had to think about during the pandemic as an auction house is typically we create these big auction catalogs that we send out to everybody. And in this period, we've really realized that that's become obsolete. I mean, both because of an issue of sustainability and the amount of paper that was using, but also because of the fact that a lot of clients are just really comfortable transacting online. We found that we completely got rid of our catalogs and just had online catalogs this season. And we still found that in these sales that we had this past year during the pandemic, 50%, so half of the bidders and buyers in our evening sale down to our online sales did not see the works in person. That's a pretty amazing stat, that 50% of the people didn't see these works and still spent, thousands to millions of dollars on these artworks. And that just goes to show the comfort level that clients are having with transacting online. Obviously, it's a learning curve and some are more comfortable than others, but it does show that we're expanding our reach in terms of that comfort, and that's turning over into how we're able to engage with our clients. This also extends into private sales, which we do as well. So in addition to auction, we also, kind of like a gallery, do transact in private treaty sales, which is a seller and a buyer come together over a work of art that's done in a more private and discreet setting. So both of those transactions did happen frequently last year, and the market was very robust despite all of these barriers and hurdles that we had to jump over. So overall, I think in terms of the market question of what I'm seeing right now, we are seeing strength, which is positive and does show a few things. One, I think that a lot of clients are looking for alternative assets in a time such as this. They're also looking to diversify and follow their passions. I think a lot of what I saw during the pandemic was that there was a focus on quality still, and a lot of transactions were happening at high levels that perhaps weren't expected. One example is the $100 million Basquiat that traded hands between Ken Griffin and Peter Brandt. So that just goes to show that there was still an appetite on the selling and the buyer side for transactions, even at a difficult time in the market. Very different than what we saw in 08 and 09. We're also seeing a huge interest in emerging artists, and that kind of leads into the next part of my presentation, which is about some of those emerging artists that we've seen at auction recently and some of those records. The way I thought to elucidate that a little more in a little more of a structured way and a little more interesting of a way is to go to question number 2 in my intro, which was, how do we actually value a work of art? How do we put this auction estimate on the piece? And what can you take away in terms of these different factors in your day-to-day looking at art and engaging with art or collecting with art? How I've kind of laid it out is I've tried to break it down in terms of different factors that we think about as specialists when we're looking at an artwork. And I should say too, when we're pricing a work of art, we first and foremost look at auction comparables. So works that have come up similarly, that are similar to the piece we're pricing, and we look at that estimate versus price realized, and that helps determine where we should start, kind of like a real estate comparable. So that's really our number one, is data. But then number two is the fact that artwork at the end of the day is subjective. I can love it, my husband can hate it, and we're both totally right in terms of how we feel about the work. You can never be wrong in terms of how you feel about artwork. So it just goes to show that that subjectivity is kind of this tough gray area in valuing a work of art. We can be at a table with 10 specialists, and I can think that a work is worth $1 million, and my other colleague can say, no, I don't agree with you. I think it's worth 500,000. And that's when we have to have a discussion about why each one of us is at that value. And you have to have that vocabulary to be able to describe why. And that's what I'm going to try and give you today, is that vocabulary. So in terms of value, what actually are we giving in terms of value? And what we're giving is an auction estimate. An auction estimate is a range of values. So this range of values actually isn't always necessarily what we think the work is worth. It is really a marketing tool in order to engage the most bidders and buyers that we can. And it's also a starting point. So that's the kind of tough thing about value, is when we're valuing at auction, we're thinking about when someone turns the page, what will that collector say? Ooh, I want to bid on this because the estimate's attractive. We need to kind of take that psychology into account, which isn't an easy thing, but it's something that we have to do. So when we're doing that, we look at a few different factors. The first four on the slide that I have are really intrinsic factors to the work itself. The last two are extrinsic, or we're actually putting these factors on the piece. So in terms of the first four, provenance is really defined as what's the work's lifetime? Where has it been in its lifetime? From the second the artist created it to the second that it's coming up for auction, who's owned it in between? And what's interesting about that provenance is that there are a few different ways provenance can factor into value. It could be owned by someone like a celebrity. That can factor into value. Famously, Marilyn Monroe's little black book sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it was really, in terms of the value of the object, just paper that had some phone numbers written into it. It can also be really fresh to the market, meaning that no one's seen the work in 50 years, 100 years. That can really be attractive to buyers. It can also come from an important collection for an important cause or a charity, and that can factor into value. So all of those are valid provenance factors. I include rarity as the next point. Rarity is really, does this piece of artwork come up often for sale, or does it come up really rarely? And, similar to a supply and demand concept in the market, obviously if something comes up more rarely at auction, the value is going to be higher. Quality, I bring up quality as well because it seems pretty simple, but if a work is of high quality for that series, for that artist, that obviously will equate to value as well. But that's something we think about often and can be subjective. Condition is really key. This is something that I'd love you to take home with you, is that always ask about condition. Obviously, contemporary art, if it was made that year, you hope that it's perfect. But for works that really even have been made in the past 5 years, definitely the past 50 years, you really always want to ask for the condition report, or ask for someone to see it that you trust who understands condition, because condition can always not always be apparent to the naked eye. And sometimes you have to look under ultraviolet light to see the history of a work, if it's ever been repaired, perhaps it's been cleaned. So condition is really key to value. And then the two extrinsic factors that I'm going to go through are taste. Market taste is really an X factor. I mean, that's something that changes often, and that for me in my position is something I think about often. which is who are the artists that are hot right now? What are people talking about? What museum exhibitions are coming up? And therefore, what are collectors going to be going after? And this is something that does affect the works that we decide to include in the auctions, but also that we have in terms of collector attention and appetite for, and that goes for private sales as well. Then the last point that I bring up is marketing. So this is also interesting because it's what I mean by marketing is sales strategy. So where these works are placed in terms of the sale that they're placed in, and also in terms of the marketing that we give them. Is it on the front sale page of Christie's.com? Is it on a window banner outside of Christie's? Those pieces of marketing can imply value to collectors and to the public by saying, we as Christie's and specialists think this merits that sort of attention, and therefore we're giving it that value. So what's interesting about that point is that it shows that value can be given to something as well as intrinsic. And that's what I'm trying to get across as well. So in order to kind of go through each one of these and further elucidate them, I'm going to actually use some recent sales for each one of these different points, which are also fun stories in and of themselves. So the first that I'm going to bring up is provenance. And I thought this painting by Sarah Z would be a good example. In my discussion on provenance, what I talked about as the last point is the concept of a charity sale, adding value to the provenance of a piece. And this is one of those examples. It was donated by Sarah Z to benefit Hopeland, which is a charity that helps pair orphans or missing children with families. And Sarah decided to give this painting for multiple reasons, but one real reason for giving this painting and this specific series was that it was extremely sought after on the market. So she knew that by giving this painting at this estimate at 200 to 300,000, it would attract attention and make the most money for the charity as possible. So in this case, these works were retailed around 350,000 at Zwirner. So, or at Gagosian, sorry. So not a huge amount compared to what it actually realized. And the reason why it made what it did, for many reasons, is because the works, when they were shown at Gagosian, were actually, if you bought one, you had to donate one to a museum. So it was kind of a buy one, give one situation. And they did have strings attached, meaning you couldn't just resell them within a certain amount of time. So the fact that the show happened May, June of last year, and then this work came up at auction later that year, no one from that show would have been able to sell those works in that time. And it was a very coveted, tough list to be able to even get one of these paintings. So that kind of goes into the rarity conversation as well, but this goes to show that that's what really drove the price at auction, was that a lot of these clients didn't have the opportunity or access to access this work. And also it's for a good cause. So it was a bit of a double structure there in terms of how this really fueled the price to go above and beyond the retail for this. The next one I'm going to bring up is Matthew Wong. He was obviously a market darling of last year, very, very sadly passed away far too early in his 30s, not long ago. And because of that, there's a rarity on the market of his works. There's only so much that he actually produced, and therefore only so much that people can actually access. So this rarity factor created an interest in the market for his work. There already was an interest in his work prior to his passing. Many reviewers said it was the best debut show they'd seen by an artist in many years when he first showed at Karma. So, he's an artist that was already being looked at, but then because of this very tragic early passing, there was a limited supply in the market and then heightened demand. So, his works were not going for very much at the time of the shows. It was just hard to access them. Again, going back to the Sarah Z conversation. So they were certainly sought after, but just not necessarily that expensive. This rarity really allowed us to place the auction estimate at a very high level, understanding works that were trading at that level. And you can see it really hit an outstanding result. So an estimate of 500 to 700,000, it makes over $4 million. Not even we really knew that would even be possible. But it goes to show that all you need is two really determined people to push the price to new levels, even beyond what was expected. So next I'm going to talk about quality. So Dana Schutz, she's an amazing female painter, contemporary painter, and she did this series of works, elevator paintings, in 2017. These were famously shown at the Whitney Biennial alongside her Emmett Till painting. And these were inspired by the Beyonce Jay-Z elevator fight. She also, interestingly, in her elevator paintings, talks about them as kind of an elevator like an eye or an eyelid. So you can see like both sides of the elevator doors opening and closing, almost like an eyelid would open and close, or a camera shutter would open and close, within which is this kind of cacophony of movement. So these are really important paintings. This was a painting that as specialists we all loved and believed in, but a work like this had never been estimated at the level that we estimated it at. We decided to sell it in Hong Kong because of interest in Asian bidders on Dana Schutz's work. And it, as you can see, really paid off. I mean, the work did extremely well, selling for over $6 million, setting a new record, and going to show that, you know, it's one of those examples when you have top quality, buyers will push to pay above the levels that have previously been set. Condition. So I thought it'd be fun to bring in Keith Haring here because the MCA Denver has the Keith Haring exhibition coming up. And like those pieces, which were from a mural that was taken apart and now will be shown at the museum, so taken out of its original context into its new context, so were the subway drawings. And this is one of the examples that I bring up here for you. Keith Haring started with his subway drawings very famously in the New York City subway, on top of either, you know, parts of the subway train or advertisements that had been kind of covered over with black paint, which is usually what they did when they were turning over advertisements. He took that as his canvas. He took the city as his canvas, and used chalk to actually draw on these different surfaces as almost a performance. You can see here as an example of that, where someone's actually then taken the entire frame of that basically where a poster would be, taken it, and then in its new context, it is now an artwork. What's interesting about this and why I bring it up in terms of condition is that, you know, condition can certainly be one of those factors where if a work has a hole in it, you know, the value goes down, or obviously if a work's repaired, or if it's been restored by a conservator or another hand by the artist, something you need to think about. But it's also important to think about condition in terms of what that means for that specific artist and what's expected of that specific artist from the series, from that period. So, you know, let's see, an old master painting is obviously going to be expected to be in worse condition than a Keith Haring, for example. So you have to think about these differences in terms of when you're thinking about condition. And why I bring up this Keith Haring is because when you look at it, there are rips to the paper, you know, there's some holes in places. You'd think if any normal piece came to you like this, you'd say, ooh, this is in bad condition. I think the value would go down. But because of the series, because of the fact that this was a performative act and was a lot of these probably rips and things like that were inherent to the piece, some probably new, but some inherent, that you give it a little bit of a break and you're able to understand that this is kind of part and parcel of the meaning of the piece and what Keith Haring intended. It's like when you see a Basquiat work on paper and there's a footprint on it. That was Jean-Michel's footprint. That's expected, you know, that's kind of part of the piece, and it's not a condition concern. It's something to be aware of and to address, but not as much of a concern. So this is where the nuances of understanding condition are really important. And it's great to train yourself to understand these different artist working methods and what they did to understand if this is really an artist condition point or if it's an actual concern of something that happened later. You can see in this piece, it did extremely well against its estimate. So 450 to 550 sells for 1.2 million. But I will say, I'm giving you kind of the best hits, and I will say that this doesn't happen for all the works that we have at auction. I'd say typically, a third either undersell or don't sell, a third sell within their estimate, and a third do really well. So I just happen to be showing you my successes because that's more fun. But, in all honesty, some of these works don't sell. And we had a work similar to this, the subway drawing, that actually didn't sell at a similar estimate just last year. So it really depends on the special sauce and depends on all of the factors that we're talking about to create these records, to create these high prices. And then that they don't always happen is just another kind of truth of the market that I want to make sure to address, since I'm giving you a lot of good highlights. Market taste is another point I wanted to address. So I bring up Salmon Tour because this was a great addition that we had in our sale in the fall, and it was dovetailing with the Whitney exhibition that opened of his work. And that just goes to show, we do think a lot about, as I mentioned earlier, what artists have exhibitions in terms of museum exhibitions at that moment, and what would be interesting to have a piece up at auction at the same time as a museum exhibition, because that can fuel demand and fuel interest in an artist. A lot of the time, what it can do, especially at a venue like the Whitney, is it just provides collectors who perhaps didn't know the artist's work previously with the survey of that artist's work, and therefore they can decide whether or not they want to engage with that market. For Salman Tour, who is a really brilliant young artist, talking a lot about identity. He's from the Middle East, as well as about homophobia. He's, I think there's a lot of different factors in his work that are extremely interesting. And this is actually a piece that's part of 3 works that he created. So there are 2 other panels to this series. And across them, there's a poem in Urdu at the top. He creates this kind of dreamscape in these images that's really haunting and beautiful at the same time. And this was indicative of the style that you saw in the exhibition. So it did garner a lot of interest. And as you can see, the estimate versus the price realized, 100 to 150,000 estimate, 822,000 price realized. It garnered a huge amount of interest in terms of the collectors who ended up going after this, and set a new record and threshold for the artist on the market, both at auction and privately. The last factor that I wanted to bring up is marketing. So I brought this up earlier in terms of, us putting something on the cover of the catalog or on Christie's.com or in a banner. One example of marketing that I wanted to provide, just for fun, because this is a bit of a unique situation that we got to deal with this, is the sale of Stan, who was a Tyrannosaurus Rex fossil. And we were able to sell him actually in our contemporary evening sale. So yes, a strange context for a Tyrannosaurus Rex, something that was chosen because really in our evening sales, they happen at night, they're typically with the highest value works that we have for the season, that it's really a masterpiece auction more than it is about time period. So we included this in the auction because it was a masterpiece of its kind. We also happen to not have fossil sales, so that was also, it was tough to fit into a category, but it actually was interesting in that component, because in that sale context, because a lot of the clients who ended up looking at the piece were clients who were interested in buying masterpieces across categories. So we had, collectors in Germany who had a collection of Impressionist and modern art and were interested in this, as well as contemporary, as well as people in the tech world. And, that was an interesting kind of reason to include it, because that means that instead of the typical buyers that would typically buy something like this, we were providing it in a new context in order to attract a whole another clientele. So that sort of interest in context creating bids is something that we think about often. It also, by being in the evening sale, we provided and kind of placed on, again, that value on the piece, saying this is important enough to be in the evening sale and is something you should look at and strongly consider. We also happened to give it its own gallery at Christie's. We tore down some of the walls facing 49th Street so that you could see it from the street looking in, which was also helpful during the pandemic because we could only allow so many people in to see the work. And so it kind of created this moment. We had video coverage, a few different online reporters picked it up, and it was in the news, and all of that kind of creates this special sauce in terms of the marketing component providing value to the piece. So last but not least, I wanted to give you a bit of a sneak peek. So you guys are the first to see these highlights. They're going to be coming up in our March 9th auction. Two of the works that I really am excited about coming up in our auction in New York on March 9th are this Titus Kaphar on the left. And I had to bring in the Keith Haring because the exhibition on the right. So Titus has really seen a huge meteoric rise at auction. He's an amazing artist. He also started his own residency program called Next Haven in New Haven, which is a pretty amazing program that focuses on artists of color and giving them all the tools they need to really succeed as an artist in this difficult moment we find ourselves in. So that will be estimated at 300 to 500,000. His works very interestingly and poignantly talk about history in general, and especially the absence of the Black subject in history. So you can see this talking about that also physically in the absence of the canvas. The Keith Haring is a super special piece, the highest value piece so far that we have in the auction. This is one of Keith's tarps that he produced. You can see very recognizable subject matter in terms of his figures. And this is going to be estimated at 2.5 to 3.5 million. It's quite large. It's about 80 inches tall. So it's a pretty amazing piece to see in person. And we will be having a view at Christie's. So if you are in the New York area, if you're traveling or if you're from there, please do come in and say hello. I'm happy to make an appointment for you to see art again. And I think it's important to also close out my section of this discussion by saying that Christie's seems like this kind of ivory tower organization, but I think what's really great about it is that it's free and open to the public. You can come in off the street and see what we have on view. You can come into our auctions. You can sit in the auctions. You don't need to reserve ahead of time. The evening sales are the only things that are ticketed, but otherwise you can come see a day sale or anything you want to see. And that's something that I find really great about working at Christie's, is that there is this kind of democratic element where, it's the highest bid that wins the piece. You don't need to know anything about the artist or the gallery, or you can just love the piece and you can be there for the art. And there's something that's really great about that. So I encourage everybody, I know it's a difficult time during the pandemic, but after the pandemic, to come to Christie's, enjoy what we have on view, and please say hello as well if you're there. So now to questions.
Kat, thank you so much for an amazing presentation. I felt like I learned a lot. And while you were talking, it made me feel like, we need, instead of a raised hand, we need a raised paddle on the Zoom feature. So you covered a lot of ground. I know there's going to be a lot of questions. And so I'll get the ball rolling with just a few of my own, and then we'll turn to some that some folks have already asked through the process of through the Q&A. And everyone, please feel welcome to add your questions to the Q&A. We're going to try to get through as many as possible. So I wanted to start to sort of get into, for folks that are just now developing their taste in contemporary art, getting their feet wet, or they're maybe new to the auction world, how would you recommend that they start to delve into that arena, develop their taste? What kind of auction dates should they look for? And how would you recommend they begin that process?
It's a great question. I mean, there's so many ways I would say that you can do that virtually, which is great. And, I think just going to Christie's website and looking at what we have on offer, from the auctions that we have to, our private sales. I would say the dates typically for contemporary for New York are March, May, July, September, November. So pretty much every other month. So we're very active. So you can always go to Christie's and see what's on. I'd say also Instagram is a great way to kind of hone your taste and what you're interested in. There's so many great galleries out there and museums, and a lot of the museums especially have great programs where you can join the museum in terms of museum groups, and that's a nice way to meet other people who are also interested in looking at art and in talking about art. I've done that myself for a few New York institutions, and I'd really say just look like a great way of saying it is, I heard this once from another colleague of mine, is you have to get your eye miles. It's a little bit of a cheesy way of saying it, but see as much as you can, read as much as you can. And that's really the way that you're going to be able to engage with art the best is enjoying it and really trying to understand what you like. And then once you do understand what you like, you can go a certain direction if you want to, but to always be open about new opportunities and use all the opportunities that you have to see art. Because as I mentioned, a lot of people, I think of the art world as a scary place sometimes, or hard to penetrate, and it's really quite open. So that's good to remember.
Yeah, and I would actually strongly agree with what you said about getting your eye miles in, looking at as much art as possible, because I often get asked, how do you develop exhibitions? And it really comes from looking and looking. And the silver lining, so to speak, of COVID is that so many institutions, from the art market to nonprofits, have bolstered their digital content. So really you can go to almost any website for so many arts institutions, see their panels, see their online exhibitions. And that's been this new way of getting your eye miles in, or getting, your exposure to art. So we do have some great questions rolling in from our audience that I think it'd be fun to get to. I do want to make sure to highlight, one person asked, when is the Keith Haring exhibition opening at the MCA? And that is February 26th. We are so excited for this exhibition. It will present murals that have never been before presented in a museum setting. So that's a very special opportunity. And I'll talk about other shows we have opening concurrently at the same time. But I want to get into a question asked, essentially saying, can you generalize about pricing differences between auctions and private sales? And maybe we could also fold in a bit like the gallery world as well, because you touched a bit about on that. For example, the difference between, say, going to Gagosian for an artwork versus checking out what's on view at Christie's.
Sure. So I'll start by auction versus private sale. So let's say you came to Christie's with the work. Let's say you came with your Keith Haring, and you're interested in getting an auction estimate as well as a private sale proposal. Really, the pros and cons of that, it just depends on your personal situation. But an auction estimate, as you saw, typically is more conservative and more strategic in order to, as a marketing tool, get clients interested in the piece to bid it up higher. So we're looking for that sort of upside. A private sale, you're able to, instead of work down upward, you're working upward down. So you're setting a high number and hoping that people come to you with that number, but perhaps they make a slightly lower offer, and then you negotiate where you want to land. The private sale gives you security of knowing that, it's up to you whether you want to accept that offer. Whereas at the auction, it's at a specific time, and once you can sign it to the auction, it's up to us to sell it well, but there's a risk factor. It's a bit of a gamble. So you have to be a little bit of a gambler in order to be comfortable with auction in that scenario. It's a risk reward as well, because if you do take the risk, you can often get the reward of the higher price. But it's something that every person has to kind of soul search a little bit and see what they're comfortable with. So I'd say too, in terms of auction houses versus galleries, it really depends on the piece and depends on the artwork. But I'd say galleries typically are more in the primary market, which is, direct from artist to consumer, versus at the auction house, we are representing the client or the collector who's consigning it to us. and it's the secondary market that we're really involved in. So that's the main difference. I'd say that galleries are great, really great resources, especially if you can have a good relationship with the director at a gallery and trust their taste or trust the gallery's taste in general. It's a great way to collect. But it's important to also take a look at auctions and see what's out there and kind of hone your understanding of the market, because the auction prices that we see are often collectors' best gauge of what the market is doing right now. So, the Sarah Z price, Gagosian hasn't raised their prices, but it certainly made the works more valuable that were purchased from there, of the Sarah Z works. So it's all kind of together in the same ecosystem.
That makes total sense. And and now our next question has to do with COVID. And I know you did a great job talking about how so many institutions have pivoted during this time. And our question is, how has the pandemic and moving virtually changed the demographics of who is interested and who attends the events? So in other words, how has COVID shifted who you're seeing in those online auctions? And just to get into psychology a little bit, how they're behaving.
Interesting. So we've actually seen about a third of the clients across all the different venues. So from online, even up to our evening sales, are a little less so there because just the prices are higher. I've seen about a third be completely new to Christie's during this time, which is super fascinating. And a lot of activity online bidding instead of over the phone, and a comfort with that. I do think that there are pros and cons to it, because although I think it is important to have online bidding be a component, we can't ignore that there is something human and physical about when you're in an auction room and you're bidding and you get carried away, you might keep going, right? And so we lose that a little bit by having people at home. There's that excitement that we're not really able to replicate as well. And we've tried, but it's tough. So I'd say, that's something that I certainly do miss, is the energy in the auction room. And I'm sure I'd love to kind of hear from you as well, because I'm sure for museums, in addition to that, like how has the pandemic and virtual events changed your demographic? I'd be interested to hear. Oh, you're on mute.
A really interesting outcome we've seen from that is that we've actually been able to go much more international with our programming. Whereas before, we were limited by who could come to the auditorium or who could come physically. It's been fascinating to see folks log in from Asia, from all over the country for our virtual programs. So in that sense, we've eliminated not only the barrier of getting dressed for the evening and coming down to the museum, but literally the barrier of even having to be in Denver. And so that's been really interesting. And also I think people at times feel hopefully more comfortable to ask questions in an online format, because there's sort of this comfort level of being able to think through your question and articulate it. So that's been really interesting to see as well. We have just a couple more minutes of Q&A. So since you mentioned how auctions are so helpful for tracking value for works of art, if you're a collector and you have a collection and you've been following auction results, how often do you recommend sort of checking in to see how values are fluctuating? How often should folks who already own a work of art be looking at the auctions just for valuation purposes, informally, of course?
Good question. I typically recommend at its minimum every year. I think you can do it even more often. You can do it twice a year, really. After each of the May and November seasons, if you have contemporary art, is a good way of judging that. And I say that because the market fluctuates a lot in contemporary art. That goes back to market taste. And typically in terms of what we do for appraising collections. So that's a whole nother part of my job, which actually usually takes up most of my day-to-day, which is working with collectors to ensure their works are properly insured, or that they're doing, appraisals for financial planning or estate planning. So those values are obviously looking towards the long term and their long-term investment. And they're something that we update at least annually, and that we recommend to keep up to date on, because it is important to understand the value of what you have as well as love it. So.
Absolutely. They're both important. Well, Kat, thank you so much for so thoughtfully answering so many questions and for giving us this really wonderfully detailed look into recent auction sales. So on behalf of myself and everyone at MCA Denver, we're so glad that you joined us. Everyone, if you've enjoyed tonight's programming, please consider becoming a corporate sponsor or renewing your support through membership. Your corporate membership gives you access to this kind of exclusive programming year-round, and it also provides us with vital support we need to continue to deliver MCA Denver's fabulous mission. We can't do it without your support. We've added the contact info for Brad Ingalls, our membership manager, in the chat so he can help you customize your corporate membership. And last but not least, while we have you, we want to make sure you encourage you to check out our upcoming exhibitions. So we, on February 26th, as we mentioned, have 3 awesome shows coming up. We have Keith Haring, Grace House Mural, which will, as I mentioned, feature an incredible suite of murals that have never before been seen in a museum context. We also have Colorado in the Present Tense, Narkita Gold, Rick Griffith, Nathan Hall, and Maya Ruth Lee. These are 4 Colorado artists responding to how we are experiencing our world today, particularly through the lens of the COVID experience. And last but not least, we have Jaime Correjo's Waiting, which will be a brand new site-specific installation created just for the MCA, really trying to delve through into the intense psychology of what it means to feel on pause or waiting for things to occur. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a joy being with you tonight, and we hope you have a great rest of your night. Thank you.
Thank you.